Last time we tried to finish the engine. This time, we finished the engine. First, we need to remove the engine stand mount to be able to put the flywheel on.
Go ahead.
In this case, the manufacturer of the hardware I'm using recommends thread lubrication, and the service manual calls out for Loctite on the threads. This is critical due to the flywheel seeing high forces and plenty of vibration. Also, make sure you're using the specific hardware called out for the flywheel.
Jesus. It surprised me.
The flywheel is held on by 8 bolts torqued to 76 foot-pounds. I went to the star pattern and torqued it in 2 steps. I also recommend having a second person on the other side to keep the crankshaft from turning. Next, we install the pilot bushing. Make sure to cover everything with some high temp urea grease and then install the bushing. Give it some light taps to make sure it's fully seated.
Why was I born with these hands? I drop everything.
I actually did this with my uncle once. I think I did too. And there's these little pins that sit around a ball.
Now we move on to the transmission. This is a 6-speed from an Acura RSX Type S that will mate up to the K24. We start by removing the clutch fork so we can replace the throwout bearing. Clean and lubricate everything, including the area where the ball pushes on the clutch fork.
Are you sure?
Before installing the clutch, we need to clean the flywheel and the pressure plate. These will come out of the packaging with some rust inhibitors, and the whole reason a clutch works is from the friction. When installing a clutch, there's a side that's marked flywheel side. The clutch will also come with an aligning tool. This is just a rod with a spline cut into it that will allow your clutch to stay centered during installation. Place your pressure plate and clutch on the tool and install it on your flywheel. There will usually be dowels meant for the pressure plate, so keep rotating until you find the correct fitment. This is where I realized I messed up.
Hardware sold separately.
My clutch kit did not come with the fastener, so I had to run to the dealership and pay $3 million for a set, so make sure to double check for the hardware when you install a clutch. The pressure plate is held on by 6 bolts torqued to 19 foot-pounds. Make sure to use the correct sequence to prevent the diaphragm spring from warping. We're going to be running an RBC intake manifold since it has one of the highest flow rates of the intake manifolds that Honda produces. Since we already installed an upper coolant housing, this manifold has a coolant fitting that needs to be cut off. We can use the gasket as a guide for the cut that we need to make. What I definitely did not do is use work resources and time to make a cut into this manifold. I ended up not removing quite enough material, so there is still interference. A little more touching up with the Dremel allowed the manifold to fit. The gasket being used is a high-grade thermal insulating plastic. I figured since it was in the back of the car with little airflow, it couldn't hurt the fight against heat soaking. Now we can install the intake manifold that's held on by 7 bolts torqued to 16 foot-pounds. Now we can install the adapter plate that allows the aftermarket throttle body to mate with the intake manifold. This is held on by 4 bolts torqued to 16 foot-pounds. If you're following this guide step by step, I actually installed this adapter upside down in this clip. Next we install the throttle body held on by 4 bolts torqued to 16 foot-pounds. Make sure to include the gasket that goes in between. Again, if you're following along, the throttle body is actually installed upside down. Now we can install the auto tensioner for the accessory belt, held on by 3 bolts torqued to 16 foot-pounds. For the K24 engine block to work with the K20 head, this setup requires an adjustable pulley from the EP3 Civic. The pulley consists of the pulley itself, a spacer, and a mounting bracket, and it's held on by 2 bolts torqued to 16 foot-pounds. Now we're moving down to the crank pulley. The service manual recommends applying lubrication on the threads and between the head of the bolt and the washer to achieve the proper torque values. The crank pulley bolt needs to be torqued to 36 foot-pounds and then turned an additional 90 degrees. I torqued it to 180 foot-pounds according to another source I found online. It may help to have a second person to keep the flywheel from turning. Now we install the alternator. The alternator is held on by 3 bolts torqued to 16 foot-pounds. I realized I had installed the wrong fasteners and forgot to record the correct part numbers, so I'll show them on screen now. Back on the top of the motor, we'll be installing the fuel rail. We're going to be using the back port for the fuel lines, and we won't be running a fuel pressure gauge, so the rest of the ports need to be blocked. Installing the fuel line, everything is hand tight, and will be tightened later when it's on the motor. We're going to be running OEM Honda injectors from an Acura RDX. These injectors are 410cc and will provide enough fuel for a naturally aspirated build. The injectors themselves just need to be pressed in until the little tab bottoms out. Repeat the process for all 4 injectors. Now we take the fuel rail, align the injectors with the ports, and press it in. It should go in with minimal effort, but I had a lot of trouble getting it to pop into place. I eventually just pressed hard enough and used the bolts to get it into place and then prayed it wouldn't leak upon startup. After I pressed it in, I noticed this gap between the tabs on the fuel rail and the intake manifold.
That is a damn shame.
Turns out there's a spacer that's also labeled as an insulator that I'm missing, so we'll leave that for now. If you're following this step by step, I jumped the gun again. We're going to be installing the half shaft, but this should be done after the transmission is already on. The half shaft is held on by 3 bolts torqued to 27 foot-pounds. Next we'll be installing the thermostat housing. Make sure to install the gasket to prevent leaks. Make sure to clean both surfaces before installing. I bought a used water pump housing that had some pretty bad pitting, so I had to use a bit of Honda Bond to seal the gaps. The thermostat housing is held on by 3 bolts torqued to 8.7 foot-pounds. Now we can install the thermostat. Make sure that the thermostat has the gasket in place before installing. The thermostat is held on by 3 bolts torqued to 7.2 foot-pounds. Now we can go ahead and install the heater pipe. Make sure that the O-ring is in place and just press it into the housing. After it's pressed in, there's a tab that'll need to be fastened up the pipe and torqued to 8.7 foot-pounds. Next, we install the bracket for the AC. This bracket is specifically made for K-swapped spiders. One thing to note that I didn't know at the time is that this will only work with K20 motors, not K24. This is held on by 2 bolts torqued to 24 foot-pounds. Towards the top of the motor, we can install the coolant temperature sensor, torqued to 8.7 foot-pounds. Next we'll be installing the starter. The starter has specific hardware, and just to hold it in place, we'll just keep this 1 bolt hand tight. Like I mentioned earlier, this is when I realized the half shaft needs to come off. Next, we'll be installing the transmission. I recommend doing this with 2 people, but if I can do it alone, you probably can too. I used the motorcycle jack to get the transmission close, then eventually got the shaft to slide into the clutch. After getting the top 2 bolts to align, we can go around and place all 6 bolts and torque them to 47 foot-pounds.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5 transmission bolts. I feel like that can't be right, but we'll roll with it.
Now we go ahead and install the half shaft again. Make sure to use plenty of grease on the shaft and the spline cutout when installing. Keep going until the bracket bolts line back up, and then torque them down to 27 foot-pounds. Next, we're installing the exhaust manifold. This was a set of headers that was modified to work on a K-swapped spider. First, clean the mating surfaces and make sure that the gasket is in place, and then we can torque down the 5 bolts to 33 foot-pounds. So back to the fuel rail. I ran to a junkyard and found a set of the missing spacers. The fuel rail is held on by 2 bolts torqued to 16 foot-pounds. Since the fuel rail is mounted now, we can tighten the fuel line and the plugs. I don't have a torque spec, so I just use my best judgment. For this transmission to work in an MR2 Spider, the counterweight on the shifter mechanism needs to be removed. Note that this is only required for this specific swap. Moving back down to the AC bracket, there's 2 tabs that needs to be cut off. Again, this is only for this specific swap. With the transmission in place, we can torque down the 2nd bolt on the starter to 47 foot-pounds. Now we move up to the valve train to do our valve lashing. What valve lashing is just controlling the clearance between the rocker arm and the valve spring. What you want to do is rotate the crankshaft until the markings on the cam gears are at the top. This means that cylinder 1, closest to the timing chain, is at top dead center when the valves are fully closed. Then we stick a feeler gauge between the rocker and the valve spring and make sure that the clearance is within spec. If it's not in spec, we just break the lock nut loose and adjust the clearance by turning the threads. When the desired spec is reached, make sure to tighten the lock nut so it doesn't move on you when the engine is running. Note that the exhaust cams have different specs than the intake cams. Then we continue to rotate the crankshaft, going through each cylinder when it is at top dead center. This is a very repetitive and tedious process, but it's crucial to the longevity of your setup. Next we install the knock sensor, which is torqued to 23 foot-pounds. Now we can install the fitting to our upper coolant housing. This is an aftermarket piece, so yours may be different. Finally, we'll be installing the valve cover. We start by cleaning any surface that a gasket will be touching. Next we install the gasket that goes around the valve cover and the coil pack holes. Then we apply a very thin layer of Honda Bond to one side of the cylinder head. The valve cover is held on by 6 bolts torqued at 8.7 foot-pounds in the sequence shown. Now we install the finishing touch, which is a brand new oil cap. That wraps up the engine build portion. Next time we're actually putting it somewhere. But until then, thanks for watching, and take care.